Well, welcome everyone to the Bay Beach Wildlife Sanctuary. We're very pleased to be able to host this workshop. Of course, if you know the Wildlife Sanctuary, you know that migratory birds is what we're all about. So this is a great pleasure to be asked to host this.
So what I'd like to do today is to give you an overview of songbird migration in the Great Lakes region, and then subsequent speakers will provide you more detail that really fill in a lot of the details that this overview hopefully will provide you. So if we take a look at a migratory songbird like this redstart, the area shown in blue in this circle is where they really spend most of the year during the winter season. So from roughly here in September all the way through until March, you can find a redstart from southern Florida to Mexico, all the way down to Venezuela, Colombia. Somewhere there, there'll be a redstart waiting for you. So that is really a big part of the life cycle. And then we're going to focus on the migration season, which for our redstarts will start as early as March and April. Then they come up to the breeding grounds where they breed. At the end of the breeding season, they molt and they drop all the worn feathers, replace them with fresh feathers so they can then migrate south back to the tropics again. So we are going to focus again on events in the migration season and also in the Great Lakes region. Just a few general comments about migration that I'm sure many of you know already. One is that songbirds migrate on a broad front, unlike waterfowl or shorebirds that may concentrate in very few areas or pretty narrow corridors across the landscape. They mostly migrate at night, although some species migrate during the day like blackbirds, but things like warblers and vireos migrate at night. That's when the air column is more stable, it's cooler, there's less water loss, so it really facilitates migration. As you know, it's weather dependent, so as they're moving north in the spring, they typically migrate when there's a south wind, and in the fall the reverse. And they'll kind of sample the air column and find the air column that is most suitable for migration. They tend to migrate on relatively warm nights, and there are a series of other weather-dependent variables that will determine whether a bird lifts off and migrates. They don't migrate very high in the atmosphere, only 1,000 to 3,000 feet above the ground typically, occasionally higher. And at least for songbirds, they don't migrate in one fell swoop between the wintering grounds and the breeding grounds. They stop at a number of sites between those two areas. And the number of sites will depend upon the condition of the bird, the weather events during migration, and a whole host of other factors. It doesn't take very long for a bird to migrate, less than what people once thought based on new techniques. So, for example, we found a Kirtland's warbler that we would just watch every day on its territory down there, and the last day was, we assumed, the last day on the wintering ground, and we knew its territory in Michigan. So we just checked it every day until it came back, and it took 13 days. That was about 1,500 miles for that 1-ounce bird to do that. Okay. So why are we concerned about migratory habitat and protecting it? One is that migration is very energetically expensive, and it's a time when the birds are really vulnerable to a whole host of events that we'll describe a little bit later. Also, all of these parts of the life cycle are intertwined, so that birds that do very well on the wintering grounds, that is, they have the best quality territories with best food, tend to depart earlier, tend to have shorter migration periods, all else being equal. They arrive on the breeding grounds earlier, and when they arrive on the breeding grounds earlier, they get the best territories. The birds that get the best territories early on typically raise more young. So there's a positive feedback loop all the way through, and if we can protect high-quality stopover sites all the way through, that facilitates that higher productivity. And also, many stopover sites are threatened, as you know, along the Lake Michigan coast, for example. Okay? So a number of studies have looked at survivorship of birds during the wintering grounds and also during the breeding grounds and found pretty high survivorship. So it's been, by deduction, it's assumed that the migration period for mortality is relatively high. So a real pioneering study done with this black-throated blue warbler, the data were collected in New Hampshire and Jamaica, ended up with this high estimate of mortality during migration. And recently, the same pattern has been shown with Kirtland's warblers. High survivorship in the wintering grounds, breeding grounds, but it appears to have fairly high mortality during migration, and this has also been shown with redstarts. Okay. Now we talk about migration being hazardous, so we have to be careful to note that it probably always has been hazardous. Because of weather, unpredictable weather, a redstart leaving from Jamaica has no idea what the weather will be like, say, when it arrives in New Hampshire. So in some springs, a redstart may arrive, and there'll be a snowstorm, and there may be pretty high mortality of birds during that event. There are also, around the Great Lakes in particular, if you get a storm across the Great Lakes, there have been a number of cases where a large number of birds washed up on the shore And in some relatively short stretches of beach, they found up to 250,000 birds washed up on the shore following the storm. Short-term events, there may be short-term effects on populations, and perhaps the birds tend to recover from those events though. And also, unpredictable resources up here that the bird doesn't necessarily know as it moves from one stop to another what those resources will be. So in some cases it might outpace the development of spring, go from a food-rich source to a food-poor source and kind of be stuck there for a while. Predation. A lot of the birds concentrate on the Great Lake shores where also there are raptor corridors. I don't know how many of you have been up to, say, Whitefish Point in the spring, and if you walk out to the tip of the point, you often see impidnex flycatchers out there perched on the driftwood right at the tip. You find almost as many heads as you do live birds because the accipiters and the sharp-shinned hawks, they just patrol that area, and the flycatchers are just sitting flycatchers, so that's it for them. Also, there's a lot of predation that occurs on these birds as well. So if, let's say, one of these impidnex flycatchers is caught out over the waters of Lake Superior at dawn, then it flies back into land to seek shelter, and they, of course, are coming lower and lower to the land as they reach the land-water interface. And the gulls are also there waiting for them. So it's surprising how many gulls will force the birds into the water and take them down to the Gulf. So those kinds of hazards have always been there. To that, we've added anthropogenic threats, habitat loss, and a lot of ways to express habitat loss, of course, direct loss of habitat. But then as you lose that habitat, it results in more fragmentation, more isolated patches, which may not necessarily be favorable for the birds. Lots and lots of invasives are coming in to many parts of the Midwest, and that effect tends to be greater in more fragmented landscapes. Water quality degradation, we'll talk about the importance of that a little bit later on, and towers, buildings, and lights that go up into the air column, and birds intercept that, hit, and fall down. That effect can be accentuated when there's a lot of lighting around the buildings. When it's foggy, the birds circle the buildings, use a lot of reserves when they hit the buildings. So these are adding to the natural threats that birds have always faced in migration. And if we look at areas where these hazards may be greatest, here's an area right here that we'll focus on. So let's say you've got a black-throated blue warbler. Let's say it was spending the winter down here in Cuba. Then they'll migrate up to the Florida Peninsula and maybe breed up somewhere here in the UP or northern Wisconsin. As they go through much of the southeast, there's a lot of forest, and these colors indicate different forest sites. So there's a relative abundance of stopover sites generally in that kind of a landscape. Once they reach the lower Midwest, they reach the soybean corn desert, so to speak, which is then punctuated with large cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Toronto, Erie, Buffalo. So you've got a combination of agricultural and urban landscapes that are generally unfavorable for the migrants. And at least for land birds, the Great Lakes pose an additional hazard. So a lot of stuff that's facing these birds in this neck of the woods. Next. So I want to talk about different types of stopover sites too. Keep in mind that this is really a gradient, but I'll describe some of the characteristics of each of these categories of stopover sites and how that might influence conservation programs. So fire escape. These are areas that are very infrequently used, but when they are used, they provide essential places for the birds primarily to rest, maybe minimal cover, and they're selected when the birds may be under stress. So let's say down here around the Gulf of Mexico, a bird, maybe one of these redstarts, for example, that we've just seen, has just flown 600 miles across the Gulf of Mexico, which they do routinely and have evolved to do. But if during the course of migration, the winds shift on them and they hit a north wind, they start to use a lot more reserves. When that happens, they have what they call fallouts along the Gulf Coast, where large numbers of birds will fall in whatever is available. So whole single trees may just fill up with birds as the birds just stop down and seek whatever they can find cover. And in the Great Lakes, there's some same thing happens on a perhaps smaller scale along the shores of the Great Lakes, but perhaps the extreme fire escape is a boat somewhere out in the Great Lakes. So if you're out in a boat or a freighter somewhere, it's not too uncommon to have birds drop down into these boats and just rest for a while. There was a Captain Perkins who used to run a freighter across the Great Lakes. He observed this so often he started keeping reasonably careful records. And he described what he called flyways across various parts of the Great Lakes, apparently areas where migrants were more concentrated landing on his boat. He got to the point where he put various shrubs and trees on his boat. So that provided essential shelter. Probably little or no food, but at least they could be on the boat. And I think one extreme case I heard where a bird may have stayed on a boat for a long time is the dark-eyed junco that showed up in Nassau in the Bahamas. So it was postulated that it landed on a boat, maybe somewhere up in the mid-Atlantic states, and just went on a cruise down to Nassau. Next. So then the next step up is a convenience store, used a little bit more often, a few more resources, maybe a little bit larger in size. Birds might have a few other options what they can do in that kind of a patch. And then the very best is what we call a full-service hotel. Used a lot of birds use them. Maybe the density of birds is lower, but more birds use them. and they have a lot of high quality food and shelter. So as you look at this landscape right here, you've got bodies of water, so you can have emerging insects feed the birds. You've got conifers, you've got deciduous trees, different slopes and exposures, and the birds can basically prospect across that landscape until they find a food-rich site. Since in any given year, the hot spot in this landscape might vary. Next. So I'm going to briefly describe some of these landscapes and how the birds might perceive these. So we'll talk about intact landscapes, fragmented landscapes, agricultural and urban, and proximity to water. So when a bird is just flying over at that 1,000 to 3,000 feet, you really can't make a decision on what kind of resources are available at any one site. It's mostly based on one of these landscape parameters. Okay? So here's a site in western part of the Upper Peninsula that we just saw. And just again, to emphasize, you've got a lot of diversity in this landscape. The water here, you've got probably shrubs that are at the edge of the forest, and the various species of trees. So just a great spot for the birds for everything it needs, resting, refueling, a little bit better protection from predators. Okay, now if we take a look at next-rad imagery, this is weather imagery you see on the TV stations depicting storms and so forth. This is in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. The station's right there. And what you see here is a concentric ring that's fairly homogeneous. So I'm not going into a lot of the details of how these images are created. You'll note that it looks like a fairly even distribution of birds that are lifting off in this area. And if you really want to look at the relative abundance, you really have to look at a fixed distance and then run a circle at that fixed distance around the radar station, compare the colors around that fixed distance, and that gives you the reflectance patterns, which in this case reflect birds that are up in the atmosphere, and then depicted in this kind of a figure. If you look at the northwestern part of the lower peninsula, there's a different pattern. You see these dark patches here, 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 and so forth. Each one of those actually occurs in a fairly large forest patch surrounded by, to a large degree, orchards. So the birds are lifting off in this more fragmented landscape, and it's a different pattern of distribution. And at the real extreme, you look out in Lake Michigan, here's Beaver Island right here. This is a fall image. You can see the whole outline of Beaver Island going south. And these are birds that are lifting off from Beaver Island. So it's clear that they're also using islands as stopping sites. Okay? Now if we go to a fragmented landscape, and northwestern Ohio is a classical case of a fragmented landscape. This is Lake Erie right here, the Tucson River. And what you see here are small little forest patches here, here, and so on, surrounded by the sea of agriculture. So in this kind of a landscape, when the bird is coming down, it has far fewer options. They tend to concentrate in these small forest patches, higher densities of birds then. And they may locally deplete food supplies. They may have a lower rate of mass gain in those patches, so they're probably not as good for the birds in terms of quality, but they're still really important stopover sites because that's all that's left on the landscape. And Chicago might be an extreme case of this. Here's Grand Park right here, with very little else left. And of course, Lake Michigan out here. And we know that a number of studies have been done in other urban centers. The birds do pile into some of these small little urban pockets. And at least in some parts, say in New York City, they found the birds still gain mass. But that probably varies a lot with vegetation characteristics of the park. Now if you take a look at these two images on the left, right here in the magenta, those are the urban areas of Chicago. The green areas, this ring around the city, mostly in the suburbs, where you've got a little bit of forest cover. And then the yellow are agricultural landscapes here. And this is the Des Plaines River, the Fox River, and down here the Kankakee River. If you look at the next rad imagery of birds lifting off from this landscape, you can see the Kankakee River right here. You can see the lower Fox, these two branches right here, corresponding right there, and the Des Plaines coming down here. So in a fragmented landscape, the birds find the available habitat, they use it, and have a very different pattern of distribution. Okay? And around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, just to illustrate some of the other patterns, including how they tend to concentrate near the Great Lakes. This is Lake Erie with Detroit over here, Buffalo in here, Lake Ontario up in here. And this is the next rad weather station at Cleveland. And you notice there's a concentration of birds bordering Lake Erie. This is the land-water interface right here. And a similar pattern in Lake Ontario up here with more birds right along here. So NextRad gives us a good broad overview of distribution of birds, and there are a group of colleagues working in New York that are studying the birds on the ground during fall and spring migration, and they're finding a somewhat similar pattern as this, with more birds closer to Lake Ontario. Now when a bird lands at a site, it has to make a lot of other decisions. So let's say when it's coming down, one of its first decisions might be, do I take a larger or a smaller patch? So birds will choose a whole variety of these patches. But when a bird tends to move, at least based on a little bit of work done around Columbus, they found that with Swainson's brushes, they would tend to move from a smaller to a larger patch and not the reverse. So there may be some patch size dynamics that affect how the birds ultimately settle. In other cases, when a bird settles down, even in an isolated woodland fragment, they may move no more than 100 meters. And it's thought that chimbling birds don't move too much, but some other studies have shown in Long Point, Ontario, for example, that they'll ban them to the very, very tip of Long Point, which goes right out to the middle of Lake Erie. And the birds will move inland, they lose them. These are birds that are fitted with transmitters. And then they'll pick them up 3 or 4 days later flying overhead. So it's postulated they leave the tip of Long Point, which is relatively poor in resources, very delayed phenology, and move to find better areas and then take off again. So it's a pretty complex pattern. We're just beginning to get a little better understanding how birds move across and use the landscape. But once you get into a site, the nature of the site may be important. And when we're looking at sites that you want to look at for protection of stopover sites exclusively compared to breeding birds, it may lead you to different approaches. So you may want more heterogeneity within a site if you're looking at managing a place just for stopover sites, because different species use different successional stages. Some species of birds like to feed in the canopy, some of the sub-canopy, some of the ground layer. So the more structure you have in your vegetation in your patch may be favorable, and that coincides with a larger number of successional stages in that patch. It also coincides with more plant species often at the site. So the time of flowering may be important. A lot of the warblers like to feed on leaves that are just emerging or on flowers of trees. So if you have different species of trees that are blooming at different times, that provides a longer time period to have good resources available for the birds. And Eric Witt at UW-Madison has done a lot of interesting work in that regard. He's also been looking at, in terms of trees, the length of the petiole, then trees that have longer petioles or short-lived stems leading to the leaf are better for the birds. It's easier for them to reach out and pull out the prey than leaves that have longer petioles. So he's really getting down to some pretty refined assessments of site quality. And then different species of plants support different amounts of arthropods. Oaks tend to be pretty rich in insects, hackberries, whereas maples are not quite so much, and other species don't have quite the arthropod load that some of these other species do. And also, fruiting species may be really valuable, especially in fall when a lot of birds are coming south and feeding on fruit. Proximity to water is important, so small vernal pools may be attractive to birds because of the aquatic insects that emerge from them. We've been working with some colleagues in southwestern Michigan and found that a distance of even 25 meters may make a difference in the concentration of aquatic-borne insects and the distribution of the birds. And seasonal factors. In the spring, aquatic-borne arthropods, such as midges, for example, may be really important areas and sites, whereas in the fall, there may be sites that produce more fruit, are more important during the fall migration season. So this is a site that illustrates a lot of these qualities. This could be anywhere in northern Wisconsin or UP. You've got a lot of conifers, you've got deciduous trees, you've got a shrub layer, and some work done in northern Wisconsin has indicated these alder swamps are really important for fall migrants. And you've got water here, so in the spring this could be a good source of midges and aquatic insects. Now, protecting stopover sites is a pretty difficult challenge in many respects because you have to have stopover sites located throughout the pathways. So they often span states, countries, and continents, and trying to integrate all this work with a lot of different cultures and economic systems and everything else can make you pull your hair out sometimes. There are a lot of different types of landscapes and sites that we need to deal with and try to prioritize which of those landscapes and sites should receive our attention first. And then, of course, translating research carefully to conservation programs is always critical. And still, one of the initial issues you deal with is how do you define stopover site quality or priority? Most people are doing this right now on the basis of relative abundance, in part because those are the only data that are available at a large enough spatial scale. But obviously, they also indicate where birds are putting down and where you've got the greatest opportunity to create the greatest number of birds. But it also can include, as we get more and more refined and sophisticated, consistency of use. So if you have sites that have a lot of birds, they're used both in spring and fall, and they're relatively large numbers between years, then that should elevate that site to a higher priority. If there's a lot of resources available, that too would also, I would think, bring it to a higher priority. It's more expensive to obtain these kinds of measures. And ultimately, you'd have it expressed in the condition of the birds. And that too, there are new techniques coming online that are a little bit easier than previous techniques, so this is not out of the question. Okay? So I just want to indicate too how I started thinking about stopover sites. The Nature Conservancy was interested in protecting the northern shoreline of Lake Huron and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We were really focusing on rare plants to a large degree and communities. It's a very complex shoreline with a lot of conifers, bays, small islands, and so forth. and it's got a lot of the Great Lakes endemic plants that we were concerned about. But we started thinking about our preserve design, remembering that migratory birds, land birds, often concentrate near a shoreline, but we really didn't have any idea how far inland those birds would concentrate. So we designed a study to have transects perpendicular to the shoreline going inland, excuse me, about 2 miles, controlling for habitat, in this case, white cedar. And then we hypothesized that because the cooling effects of Lake Huron are really dramatic and the phenology is delayed, that the birds might land here initially, but probably be poor in food resources and just move inland because the leaves are a little bit better developed as you escape the cooling breezes of Lake Huron. So we talked to a bunch of experts and they all thought that was a good idea. So then we set up our counts along the shoreline, and lo and behold, we were just absolutely wrong. That the birds were all stayed right here in the shoreline. And as we were doing our counts, it became evident why. If you look at this slide down here on the lower left side, each one of these dots here represents a midge. So literally millions and millions of midges are coming from these nearshore waters. And it just kind of overturned how we thought about protection at this site, but also got us thinking more broadly how might we begin to apply these results around the Great Lakes. So this is a pretty short distance in this particular landscape where the midges are concentrated, but this midges, people have described this, and once you mention this, I could hear a couple of other people say, yeah, why didn't you think of that before? And so now it's changing how we look at our predicting where stopover sites should be. So the red sites and other warbirds really concentrate in these types of areas during migration. So now we've taken this kind of information, we've gone through literature reviews, added a whole bunch of other studies, worked with a lot of graduate students, a variety of universities around the Midwest, and starting to build these models. We started out in the West to predict where stopover sites should be. Audubon has important bird areas which are really good. They're obviously site-specific, but given the fact that migration is such a broad perspective, we needed something else to try to predict where they would be. So we started out in the western Lake Erie Basin because that area has high concentrations of land birds during spring in particular, but also shorebirds and waterfowl. So we wanted to look at all the bird groups with this exercise. Then here in Wisconsin, Kim Gravel's, a bunch of other people, Sumner Manson and others in this room, kind of became intrigued, so they started building models for Wisconsin, using local studies and fine-tuning and adapting what we did in western Lake Erie. And similarly, in Chicago Wilderness, Ducks Unlimited did this for Saginaw Bay in Michigan, worked with some Canadian colleagues, then modified it for the Lake Huron, Erie, and Ontario shores in Ontario. And now we've kind of stepped back and try to generalize from all of these and try to put together a more generalized model. Whenever you put a generalized model together, of course, there are hazards with that because you lose some of the resolution of these models. You're also constrained by the types of data layers you can work with to describe these, but we still took a lead. And we'll describe that in a little bit, okay? So I'd like to also note that you can't do this alone. It requires a huge number of collaborators wherever you work, and bringing in literature and review from people both in and outside the Great Lakes region. So what we've done is build one of these models, these generalized models that apply to Lake Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario and connecting waters. We also recognize that these models do very little good if they're not used, so we're developing a web portal to try to communicate some of the results of this and some associated resources. Okay? So just to describe some of the attributes we use to get some idea how general they are at this point. Basically, we scored all suitable habitat within a kilometer of a Great Lake as being important for stopover sites. Partly the landfall effect, partly things like the midges, and so on. We also looked at other landscape features. We talked about full-service hotels, and they generally get larger habitat patches and landscapes with a higher proportion of landscape and natural cover. And based on estimates of density of migrants in other landscapes elsewhere in eastern North America, we use this as a threshold to define an important type of landscape for landbird migrants. And we also took a somewhat different approach here where the cover for birds was really bad. And so we felt that stopover sites were important areas to focus because there wasn't any habitat and the birds are kind of sunk. So we also rated areas with less amount of suitable cover fairly high and the intervening area a little bit less. We also scored areas within 100 meters of wetlands as being important, again, getting back to the midge outbreaks and so forth. So if we look at Green Bay, this is based on CCAP data layers. Got the agricultural land, urban centers, some of the forested lands up here. We built from these data layers to describe what we call suitable habitat. Then we applied our criteria for ranking stopover sites, and we see we just ranked everything within a kilometer of Green Bay as being important, and we rank areas further back as being less important. Because in other studies in other parts of the Great Lakes, it's shown that there are lower concentrations of migrants as you get away from the Great Lakes. We recognize that there are going to be a lot of local variation and this sort of thing, so additional work will be needed to refine these models. In fact, at one of the presentations in Racine, it was looking, based on NextRat data, that this particular part of Green Bay may be more important to landbird migrants than the west side. So I'll leave it up to you to begin to think about that kind of assessment. Okay? Then we've done something similar for shorebirds. Less available habitat. We use primarily emergent wetlands and hydric soils as our basis for identifying shorebird habitat. Okay? And waterfowl. So a lot of overlap of dabbling ducks and shorebirds. So you see a lot of overlap in the important areas that we identified for shorebirds and dabbling ducks, but also in waters of the Great Lakes. And here, there's going to be a lot of additional work that needs to be done. The diving ducks and most ducks occur in forage in water that's 4 meters or less in depth. Some of them will go out and roost up to 9 meters based on some of the literature, and beyond that we don't really know. But in this model, we didn't exclude any part of the Great Lakes, and that was in part because we know so little about the distribution of birds in the open waters of the Great Lakes, and old squaws are known to be in pretty deep water. So we know that this model will have to be changed fairly quickly once these new data begin to come in. Next. So now we're building a web portal, and we have a workshop actually next week here in Toledo, and some in this room will be here and be at that workshop to help us assess whether the kind of information we're currently building in this web portal will be useful, and whether the functionality of the web portal will be helpful, and whether just the operations make it user-friendly. When this is all done, this will be available for anyone to access. Next. And you'll be able to look at outputs from this model. So this is a polygon that one can describe, right here shown in yellow, right here. I can't imagine why anybody would want to describe habitat at this particular polygon, but this is an illustrative purpose. And from this, you can identify the proportion of the landscape of suitable habitat by bird group in this 25-kilometer zone around the shores of Lake Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario, and connecting waters. So if you look at the table on the top, there will be a table that's displayed when you click on a polygon like this, and then you can depict the proportion of the landscape and the proportion of that landscape that's protected that is in these various scores by each bird group, with 5 being the most favorable habitat and 0 being completely unsuitable habitat. So if we look at land birds and the distribution and the amount of habitat that's scored very high in these zones, in this polygon, it's approximately 1.7% of the landscape based, again, on the data layers that we used. Then you can also overlay a protected data layer, the Carl protected data layer, and you can estimate what proportion of this 1.7% is protected. So based on the categories of protected lands that are in Carl, it's about 17%. So if you ever get to the point where you're setting goals and that sort of thing, you can begin to add these up and see whether you've achieved your goals. So this is a first step to do this. We realize there'll be bugs in this as we proceed. We realize it will improve as new information comes online. But we think this will be helpful to us, at least in our conservation programs. Okay, now a lot of action can take place long before you apply these models, because something's pretty obvious. So one is producing a manual like this that describes what you can do, anything in your backyard to fairly large corporate lands, to restore land, to create habitat, and so forth. So, and this has just been done here in Wisconsin, was out on the table. Okay? And in Ohio, we worked with a company right on Lake Erie, east of Cleveland. They were mowing 10 acres of land. It was costing them about $10,000 a year to do that with a mowing contract. So what we suggested they do, just let her off. So they save $10,000, and you begin to create some stopover habitat for birds in an area that would rank very high because it's right on the lake shore. Next. We've also worked with some of the major energy companies in Michigan. So this berm right here is right along the Detroit River. It's right in a highly urbanized area. So we worked with DTE Energy. They put in all the resources to plant prairies. They put in shrubs that were favorable to migrating birds on about 30 acres in an area that's pretty much surrounded by brownfields. And so this becomes, maybe it was a pretty bad fire escape at one time, so maybe edging toward a convenience store anyway. And then we work with other partners in this area, say with Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. So here, Greg Norwood here is taking out Phragmites, and this will increase the quality of habitat for migrants moving through that same Detroit River corridor where there's a real shortage of habitat. So you'll be hearing about Forest Beach, but I think it's an outstanding example of a parcel of land has been purchased and converted to stopover habitat. And these areas then can provide habitat for things like Kirtland's warbler. The Lake Erie shoreline, for example, is a real hotspot for migrating Kirtland's warblers. No surprise, it's right, you're really close to the breeding grounds, and it's kind of en route from direct line from the Bahamas. But I know they've shown up in Wisconsin and elsewhere, so these may provide critical refuge for things like this species. We're also looking at other larger types of restoration. So the Nature Conservancy has partnered with Ducks Unlimited in Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge near Toledo, and we're converting agricultural lands to wetlands that will provide, these mudflats will provide favorable habitat for migrating shorebirds and dabbling ducks. There are also various fish ladders in here, so it also should help spawning fish and lead to hopefully greater fish populations in Lake Erie that are not around gobies. So this will be about 1,400 acres that's being done, and this is likely to be, there's additional work in progress about the same magnitude. As all of you probably know, birding is an increasing activity and an increasing contributor to local economies. So tour companies are coming from around the U.S. to come specifically to the Great Lakes because of birding opportunities, and this is being further enhanced by birding festivals that are being hosted by a lot of communities. In Michigan, it's estimated that 11% of the tourists that come to the state watch birds, for example. I don't know, it's probably not really intensive in many cases, but they do come to watch birds. Okay? Back in 2006, it was estimated that birders spent $10 billion worldwide on traveling to see birds. So these are kind of your hardcore birders. And it's probably hardcore birders that are going to use this kind of information here with the development of a lot of birding trails. So they may fly into Detroit Metro here from Stockholm or London, and then they'll go down to watch the extremely important concentrations of migratory birds down in here in McGee Marsh in Ohio, where there's a birding festival, and here at Point Pelee National Park in Ontario. And if you want to see some of this spectacular birding, you need to make your motel reservations about 8 months in advance here at Point Pelee. And I suspect it's probably not much different in McGee Marsh these days. Thousands of people come here. Then people will rent a car, or the tour company will go on up to Saginaw Bay, another suite of birds. We'll go to Tawas Point, another real hotspot that one of the leading birders, John Dunn, described as the best birding place he's been in all of North America. Then they go on up to see the Kirtland warblers. I realize there are Kirtland warblers in Wisconsin, which is great. And here they have tours to see these birds that are hosted by a couple of agencies from May through about the 1st of July. Then they'll go on up to Whitefish Point and see still another group of birds, boreal chickadees, boreal owls, that you won't see anywhere to the south here. So they make really impressive birding packages, and American Birding Association is some of the 10 most wanted birds in North America. Quite a number of them you'll see on this kind of a tour. Next. Now, there's a lot we don't know. If we're really going to be most effective in our conservation program for stopover sites, it's essential that you know where the populations are coming from in the tropics and move to the upper Midwest and what their route is. Right now, there are no good techniques to do that. Some of the geolocators are getting at some of the route information, which is great. So there's some information beginning to emerge from banding, which is also helpful. Isotopes provide a very generalized sort of approach. But we'll get increasingly specific as time goes on. And this will help us then determine where our best stopover sites should be. One thing we don't know, even with these techniques yet, is where migrants are most susceptible. Even with geolocators, you have to recapture the birds, so you don't know where the birds are dying along the migratory route. So once we know that, that too will allow additional prioritization. We'll take new techniques once maybe the batteries get smaller on satellite transmitters or something like that. Once we have all this information, or this is an issue we're dealing with now, we've got a choice of building a network of mini sites or expanding to existing larger patches. So we're going to have to be more and more strategic how we think about placement of these different types of stopover sites. And we'll have to account for potential climate change as well. At a fine scale, we also need to figure out the best way to assess what really high-quality stopover site is. We've used a mostly relative abundance of birds, but there may be better and improved ways to do that. We also need to know how migrants disperse after landing. Just some of this new work that's coming out has been quite surprising to many who have studied stopover sites. So this type of, the way the birds disperse affects then how whether you build a network of mini sites, whether you should expand existing larger patches. In terms of wind energy, it also is really important to know the angle of ascent and descent as birds come down to the stopover sites, and it's relatively poorly known. Wind turbines are probably not the most important factor in mortality of migratory birds, but it is a contributing factor and could be locally more important in other areas. Thanks. So in the future then, this kind of a workshop is great because it's increasing awareness on the relative importance of stopover sites. We know we need to refine our models. We expect that the models that we're just releasing now, they're already a little bit out of date and they'll have to be updated periodically. And we also know that we're going to have to integrate at larger spatial scales to get this whole life cycle context to find out where bird populations are most susceptible. Okay, I think there's one back. So, we need to protect all three categories of stopover sites. It needs to be range-wide, and these are probably the types of things that are going to be overlooked by most conservationists. So we may need to really look at the firescapes, the distribution of firescapes and convenience stores carefully. So I'd like to thank the Upper Midwest Great Lakes Landscape Conservation Cooperative for funding our most recent work. We were very fortunate to get funding from the George Gunn Foundation in Cleveland, Ohio to get this all started in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And really applaud the Wisconsin Stopover Initiative. I don't know of any other initiative like that anywhere in the country. It's really unique. And Kim Brevels and those who built this up, really it's outstanding effort. And also the Ozaki Washington Land Trust is their innovative work at Forest Beach. It's really exemplary. It will set the stage for future work. And then there are probably thousands of other collaborators that helped get us this far.